Good morning. Reeser. Okay. Good to see you all. I hope you had a good holiday, some time off. Give you a chance. You need to. Thank you, sir. You got to get set up, yes?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll give you a second. There's a student is setting up her computer in the back. She has to plug it
She's like,
Doobie doobie doo 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 doo. Da 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 da. Just waiting for her to get her computer out and to set it up.
No, I think I doesn't do it that No, so like.
I dropped it.
Alrighty, everybody. It's good to see you. I hope you had a good holiday. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I got 3 announcements. Hope that I can remember them that I wanted to make. Remember that the papers, I've extended the deadline for the paper, so it's due on Saturday, I believe. Yes? I believe it's not due on Saturday, which is December 2nd. And just a clarification, I think it's on the instructions, but I just want to make it clearer that remember when you're answering the question, answer it from the perspective of a Catholic bioethic. I think I added a little instruction, a little please note section that says that Mary, the person in the, I believe I gave her the name Mary, the person who's in the hypothetical situation is a Catholic and does not believe that the direct killing of a human life is morally permissible. You could also assume that she's at a Catholic hospital and will not do any something like an abortion. Assume that even if you don't agree with the position, okay? What I'm trying to do is see that you can understand what the principle of double effect means and how you can apply it to a concrete situation. That's the important point. Not necessarily looking for you to give me your opinion on, well, I don't think it's a human life, so whatever she decides to do is okay, you know, or the doctors decide to do. Assume the Catholic position and apply that. Because you're dealing with a Catholic, at least in the hypothetical situation, you're dealing with a Catholic woman who has certain beliefs about what should be done and not done. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, I was just looking at the syllabus, and I guess I should have been looking more closely at it, but I thought I was on task and that I was on time with my lectures, but apparently I've gone over. Actually, I was ahead of the game early in the course, I noticed, and I thought, okay, I'm going to have nothing to say. I'm going to have some open lectures at the end, But then I got it back on schedule, and then somewhere I lost it again. So I might not cover everything that's in the syllabus. Like I might not cover transgenderism. I might not cover assistive reproductive technologies. So whatever I cover, and I'm not going to test you on what I don't get to. Just as the main message. So don't worry about that. Hopefully, I'll get to it. But I noticed we only have 3 classes left. And I'm like, wait a second, I'm talking on euthanasia today. So whatever I only cover in class is what you'll be tested on. So don't worry about that. And if I don't get to something, I just don't get to it. That's just, it happens, and I apologize for that. Hopefully, I will get to it. And there was a third thing. I knew I should have written it on the board. There was a third thing. Well, maybe it's not important. I mentioned the paper. I mentioned the that. Well, if I think of the third thing, I'll come back to it. But anywho. Okay. Oh, that's right. Now I remember the third thing. Well, it's part of the lecture, but it's also a third thing. Now we're starting to go kind of transition from principles that I've been talking about in ways of looking at how to apply ethics, especially in a medical situation or a life health situation. Now we're starting to apply it to how people actually apply those principles in situations where the principles might be applied. I just want to say up front that I in no way am making any judgments on anybody, because I understand that when you talk about issues like, say, euthanasia or abortion or birth control, I might have students in the class. It's probably not likely that a lot of you have had experience of euthanasia, but you never know. I might have a student who's had an uncle or an aunt or a father or mother who is at end of life and decided to, have a euthanasia done, whether legally or illegally. Hold on a second. Depending on the state you're living in. And I don't want to seem as if I'm coming down judgmentally. I have my own soul to worry about, my own issues that I'll have to address at the end of my life. And God has not placed me here on this earth to judge other people. Even Jesus said that he did not come to judge, but he came for the salvation of the world. Okay, although he did make judgments a lot, but nevertheless, the principle still applies. I did not come to judge, but came that people might be saved. So that's it. I just wanted to point that out. So I'm not making any judgments on anybody. I'm not looking down on anybody or saying that, oh, if you've done this, you're a bad person, or you should have done this, or whatever. I just wanted to point that out because it can get dicey and people can get triggered, and I don't want that to happen. Okay. So we're talking first about euthanasia. What is euthanasia? Euthanasia, in our introduction, an act or omission by which by itself or by intention causes the death of another person in order to relieve that person's suffering. Euthanasia. Literally from the Greek words eu, which means good, and thanatos, which means death. We kind of already know that in a way because, we have that prefix in American English. Euphony means good sound, so something is euphonious, it sounds good. Eugenics, which is good genes, if you want to, manipulate genes so that people don't have diseases, they have good genes, that's eugenics. Manipulate the genome. What's another one I can come up with? Euphoria, good feeling, So we have that word already, euthanatos, which means death, a good death. Okay? So it's something that you do or don't do. And you're intending the death of another person. Why are you intending it to end that person's suffering? According to the Merriam-Webster Medical Dictionary, the 2016 edition, just another way of putting it, the act or practice of causing or permitting the death of terminally ill or hopelessly sick or injured individuals in a relatively painless way for reasons of mercy. That's another way of putting it, a little more verbose. And I might quibble with the fact that you're hopelessly injured, because what does hopelessly injured mean? I mean, is someone who has had both of his legs amputated, or a woman who's had, both of her legs amputated, well, that person is hopelessly injured. There's no hope of getting the legs back. Say if you're a diabetic or something, or you've got gangrene and they have to surgically amputate part of your body, that's hopelessly injured. You're not getting those portions of your body back, those parts back. Does that mean that you are open to euthanasia then? Oh, because I can't deal with it, And also the fact that it says relatively painless way for reason. Well, hopefully painless. I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, if the person is suffering, you want to end their suffering, so you give them suffering to end their suffering, relatively painless, which means it could be painful, but maybe, I guess, not as painful as what they're going through. Maybe if you choke them instead as a form of euthanasia rather than giving them a drug. I don't know. For reasons of mercy, we've had the word mercy, which is the kind of compassion that you give to someone who is under your care. So euthanasia, can mean dying with as little pain distress or suffering as clinically possible. And in Jura et Bona, which was the reading, hopefully you've done the reading already following the syllabus, the Declaration on Euthanasia from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith of the Catholic Church, in its Latin words from its opening words, Jura et Bona, it's called Jura et Bona. In Jura et Bona, the CDF notes, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith notes that euthanasia originally meant an easy death with little or no suffering. Okay, so there's maybe a non-problematic use of the word euthanasia, because it originally means a good death, that a person dies with as little or no suffering as possible. That's its ancient meaning. Recently, though, it means a doctor's killing the patient, usually with the patient's consent. Usually, not always. Check out the Netherlands, where euthanasia has been legal for like 20 years or something like that. They do have instances of people being involuntarily euthanized. So this is what its recent meaning has come to be. A doctor, a physician, actively kills the patient with the patient's consent. Euthanasia can encompass 3 different aspects depending on who is killing whom. And when I say killing, that's what's going on. I mean, that's obvious. There's no other word for it than to say you're ending the life. I guess I could speak euphemistically, you're ending the life of. So depending on who's ending the life of whom, there are 3 different aspects. There is, well, I'll get to this in a moment. There is euthanasia proper. We could say euthanasia proper. Mr. Thomas. There is euthanasia proper, where someone directly kills or takes the life of another with his or her consent. This is properly called euthanasia. The direct taking of the person's life with their consent. But there is an improper way of talking about euthanasia where someone indirectly kills another with his or her consent. And this is what we would call physician-assisted suicide. So there's a difference between euthanasia proper, in its proper sense, and then in its improper sense as physician-assisted suicide. And what is that? It is the condition under which a physician provides a person with the means for killing himself or herself. So the doctor or the physician will prescribe an overdose of medication that the person can take, or a certain medication that will cause the heart to stop or them to stop breathing or something. But the physician doesn't actively do anything, whereas in euthanasia proper, the physician actively kills the patient. So the physician is giving the patient the means to effect death through the prescribing of a lethal drug, but is not effecting the death itself. Also coming under an improper use of the word euthanasia is the word suicide. Suicide is a kind of euthanasia, but in this case, someone directly takes his or her own life, directly kills himself or herself. So that's what suicide is. The Latin word suis means oneself, and cedo means to cut off, to cut down, or cut to pieces. Basically to kill, but literally it's to cut. So to cut oneself or to cut oneself off. A suicide. Hence, physician-assisted suicide, because the person himself or herself is the one who actively does the killing or the taking of the life. The physician just provides the means. Hence, it's not really euthanasia itself. It's more of assisting a suicide, helping a person in the act of this, which is suicide. There are 2 main kinds of euthanasia, or types of euthanasia we can talk about. There's active euthanasia and passive euthanasia. I've already been using this language of active. And there are 2 types of each, which are basically the same. There's active involuntary euthanasia, there's voluntary active euthanasia, there's also passive euthanasia, which can be also involuntary or voluntary. What do those mean? Good. Active, let's start with active involuntary, the first one. Active means active directly involves killing the patient, that there is an action that's direct, its direct effect or goal is to take the life of the patient. And active, so it's active. Someone is doing something, someone is performing an action that has an effect. There's a cause and effect linkage there. And it's involuntary because the euthanasia, the act of euthanasia, is undertaken without the authorization of the patient in the informed consent process. So there's no consultation with the patient or the person whose life is going to be taken. According to the Lawrence McCullough in his Historical Dictionary of Medical Ethics, active involuntary euthanasia is ethically impermissible, according to the canons and the codes of medical ethics, to professional medical ethics, because it violates the professional virtue of integrity. Remember, we talked about the virtues and we talked about the professional virtue of integrity. So you can go back and look and see what that is. Excuse me. Remember, informed consent is part of the principle of autonomy from ethical principlism, that the patient has a certain autonomy, not absolute from the Catholic perspective, because we're autonomous in a sense, but we also have influences and we have authorities that we have to follow and are over us. But the principle of autonomy says that, it's your body, you know your body, you know how it works, it's personal to you, and as a person, you can determine what should be done to your body. And therefore, you need informed consent if you're going to perform an operation or a surgical procedure or medical procedure, or enter into a testing regimen where they're testing a drug or some kind of medical device. So euthanasia, active involuntary euthanasia, would violate that principle as well, the principle of autonomy. Now, active voluntary, again, you have the active taking of the life, but it's voluntary. The killing the patient is done with the patient's authorization in the informed consent process. So that's kind of obvious, okay? And one, there's no consent, and then the other, there is. So one is voluntary and the other is not voluntary. Okay, Mr. Serravo. Let me just check my PowerPoint. I want to see if I did that. Okay, no, I'm coming to that though. Now, we're talking about the passive forms of euthanasia. Okay, passive involuntary, the first one, involuntary. This is discontinuing life-sustaining treatment to let the patient die without or possibly against the patient's consent. Okay, so it's passive. So you're not actively doing something. There is no positive action or activity that's going on there. So you're not a physician who's giving an injection of a lethal chemical to a patient to cause his or her death. No, in passive, you're basically stepping away from the patient. You're causing the death by not doing something. You're not giving them treatment that would sustain their life, and it's involuntary because it's against the patient's consent. So, for example, I don't talk about this later, but I'll mention it now because it popped into my head. There was the Baby Doe case, which I believe was in the 1980s because it was during the Reagan era. Ronald Reagan was president, so it must have been in the 1980s. The Baby Doe case that was born at a hospital, and it was a mentally disabled baby but it also had something wrong with its throat, with its esophagus. I think it wasn't fully formed, or there was some kind of growth or something that was making it impossible for the child to eat. So, nothing could go down the esophagus to get to the stomach. And so, because it was a mentally disabled baby, now it could be surgically treated. It would have been a rather, there was a solution. They could perform surgery on this neonate, this infant that had been born. But once the parents realized that it was a mentally disabled baby with Down syndrome, they said, no, we don't want it. So don't perform the surgery. Okay, so passive. You're not doing something. But it was euthanasia, and it was euthanasia because the baby basically starved to death. And that's what happened. They left the baby in some corner of the ward, and the baby just eventually starved to death because it couldn't be fed and couldn't eat. For something that was a treatable ailment, a treatable disease. It was involuntary because, of course, it was against the baby's wishes. The baby would probably have wanted to live. You could make the argument that it might have been passive voluntary in the sense that the parents are guardians of the baby, or were guardians of the baby, and they were making that informed consent decision on the baby's behalf. But it didn't seem to be in the best interest of the child, because all it was a simple. I got you, sir. All it was a simple defect that could have been surgically removed and repaired, and the baby would have eaten fine. The game changer was that it had Down syndrome. Yes, sir.
Oh, well, you answered my question. I was going to ask if the surgery would 100% dealt with the problem.
Oh, yeah.
You said it wasn't.
Yeah, in the baby no case, it would have. It would have. The child wasn't suffering. Okay, so it wasn't an incurable disease. As I said, the game changer, the thing that was the problem was that it was a mentally disabled child, and the parents didn't want it, so they just said let it die. So that would be an example of passive involuntary euthanasia, because you're presuming that it's against certainly against the child's consent, which you would assume want to live. Passive involuntary euthanasia is, according to Lawrence McCullough in the Historical Dictionary of Medical Ethics, it is ethically permissible provided that the patient's wishes are unknown and discontinuing life-sustaining treatment is based on the best interest standard of surrogate decision-making. So in the case where you have a patient that is incapacitated or incompetent, and there are no family members present, or maybe not alive or living, and the person has no one to speak for them, then in that case, you, the physician, become the surrogate, and you have to advocate for the best interests of your patient, and you might have to take a stand that it's in the best interest of your patient that life-sustaining measures are discontinued. And what is this best interest standard? This is it. This is what it's talking about. The norm or norms by which a surrogate, someone who's a stand-in for someone else, decides regarding the clinical management of a patient in order to best protect and promote the patient's health-related interests. So it might be this issue of medical futility comes in. It might be a very elderly patient where there could be an operation performed to there's something that is curable and is treatable, but performing the operation might be medically futile. It's not going to extend the life by a significant amount of time, this elderly patient. It also might be dangerous. It might be a dangerous surgery for the elderly patient. The person might die. And so you might say, okay, we'll just leave them with this condition and give them palliative care in preparation for death. So what are the best interests? So now you would assume that that's against the interests of the patient. So it's involuntary, but it is also passive. You're not giving a treatment. The best interest standards, loss of health. I don't know why I put that there, so I'll skip over it. Passive voluntary is, again, where you're discontinuing life-sustaining treatment for the patient with a terminal or irreversible condition with the patient's consent. And this is what's called sometimes letting die. So passive voluntary euthanasia might be ethically permissible when it implements the patient's voluntary informed decision. So a patient is, again, oh, good. Hello. So Ada. Okay. Y. Say again, you have an elderly patient who is who has a serious illness, which is really the person's dying. The illness is not treatable anymore. The person is in the stages of death. And or it doesn't even have to be an elderly patient. It could just be someone who has a disease that's in its last stages and they're simply dying and there's really no way to treat the disease, or it's an incurable disease. And in that case, you could remove life-sustaining treatment, such as not perform medical procedures anymore that, again, are going to be medically futile. You should still, of course, try to feed the person and give the person fluids. But even in some cases of the stages of dying, that causes discomfort and pain to the patient, and the body might not be able to metabolize them. So even that can sometimes become burdensome. So the patient decides to allow the disease to take its course, the pathology to take its course, and to die. So it's passive. You're not doing something. You're not killing the person, and it's voluntary. The patient understands what's going on, is competent to understand, and makes that decision that, okay, I'm okay with this. And so in that case, you move them to hospice care and you take care of them and try to manage their pain or any suffering that they might have as they're on their way out. So it could be ethically permissible. And also it could be permissible in the case of a patient lacking decision-making capacity when that patient has left an advance directive, what is called a living will. There's other terms for it, but it's usually called an advance directive, where a person might say, if I stop breathing in the court, because in some cases of certain diseases that you have respiratory failure, and it happens a lot, and the person might just say, if I stop breathing because of this disease, don't resuscitate me, let me die. It's okay. Now that can be permissible, even from a Catholic perspective, because your intention is not to, you don't have to keep yourself alive at all costs. Okay? Eventually the body does die naturally. I mean, I think you all know that by now, right? You're all adults. Hopefully you can all deal with it, because, 'cause that's one of the great fears of the human species, according to Sigmund Freud, is that the fear of death. It's one of our drives, that we're scared to death of dying. But it's a natural reality, Did God want us to die? No, He wants us to live forever, but we chose death. We chose sin and death. So it's now become a natural part of our experience. So it can be accepted. There is that possibility, and that would be passive voluntary euthanasia. Okay. Is it too dark in here? Do you want the lights on? No, you're okay? All right. That's fine. Because, the sun was out. It was beautiful, but now it's gotten cloudy. Oh, there was snow on the way here. I was driving to see the snow. Is it? Yeah. Huh? What?
She was talking to me.
Yes, she did. Oh, okay. Oh, you weren't saying anything to me, Miss Springhart. Okay, that's fine. Okay. In dealing with this bioethical issue. Okay, so that's the issue we're talking about, is euthanasia. And so now I think you understand what it is and the different types of euthanasia, different situations in which there can be euthanasia. But how do we form our consciences? How do we form our ethics about what to do or to not do? Because I think not everything, a patient asks, you have to do. You have an addict come into the emergency room and they're like, give me drugs, Well, you're probably not going to do that. The nurse is going to say, okay, yeah, let me get you some amphetamines or something like that, and just pour them down their throat, It's like, have a good trip, See you in a few days. No, probably not. And you will have that happen to you as doctors and nurses. You'll have addicts come in, people who are enslaved to drug abuse who will come in and will fake illnesses and stuff like that just so they can get a prescription of some drug that they want. Probably ethically, you're not going to do that. The same thing with someone who says, kill me. You don't know what kind of pain they're really in, obviously, because you're not in their body. But there can be people who are in deep depression and they're in certain mental pain and they want to die. And ethically, probably you want to take a second look if the person just says, kill me. You're probably not going to, immediate reaction is like, okay, you have a right to euthanasia, we'll do it, we'll set you up. Because there might be psychological issues. There might also be health issues where the pain is not as bad, or the pain is bad but manageable, and there are other options than just killing the person. Because their belief in wanting to die is a mental state. The mental state. Whether they're dying or not is another issue. The body, if the body's dying, then the body's dying. That's the machine breaking down. But wanting to die is a mental state, which can be different for every person. Some people, it might take very little to push them over the edge. Other people can suffer through a lot of pain, and they're fine. They know they're dying, but they know it's a lot of pain as well, and they push through. So, there's a spectrum. Okay, so you have to make a judgment call. You have to make judgments, and that's part of decision making. Remember, there's deliberation, there's judgment, and then there's choice. So you have to think about it. So what are the sources for the formation of conscience? Well, our old friends, truth, natural law, and positive law. Okay, I'll deal with each of those in turn. Starting with truth. Frankly and honestly, it seems to be, I don't know if there's any other way to see it, and if you can see it another way, please, raise your hand and tell me, because, always assume that someone knows more than you do or knows something you don't. Honestly, euthanasia is a form of killing. It is a form of taking of a life. I mean, it's embedded in the very word, thanatos, death. Okay, there is a causing of death. That's without making any ethical judgment on the practice. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying, what is the practice that is being done? Okay, either actively or passively, a person's life is being taken or a death is being caused. So euthanasia is a form of killing. Whoops. I think I left out a word here. How does it take a person's life? Okay. I wrote my sentence, but I wrote it in a roundabout way, so I have to figure out what I meant. Anyways, the purpose of the killing, yes, the goal, you might say the intention is to free the person from incurable or hopeless suffering or pain that the person is going through. That might be the intention, but that's not the intent. Remember, in a moral action, there is the object, there's the intention, and there are circumstances. Okay? You have, what's the object? Killing. Okay? Taking a life. What's the intention? To spare them further suffering from whatever. What's the circumstance? Well, the suffering may be coming from the fact that the person was a smoker and has lung cancer, which is spread throughout the body, and they're in great pain and they're dying from that cancer. Okay? So those are the circumstances. Dealing with the intention is to relieve them of pain, but the euthanasia, the actual action, doesn't relieve them of pain. The direct effect of the action is to take the person's life. It doesn't relieve pain. That's a side effect. But what you're doing is taking the person's life to create that effect. Also, the life that is taken is innocent. Innocent meaning that it does not deserve to be killed. This life does not deserve to have its life taken. So it's innocent. The act of killing is not accidental, so it's not something that just kind of happens because of what you do, you know. You may have intended it or not, but it just happens from your action, you know. It's not an accident, but it is intentional. This is the way that you're going to relieve the pain of the person. It's the means that you're going to use for the end. So if it's the killing of an innocent person, you could argue from truth, or looking at the truth, that we're talking here about a form or a type of murder, which is the taking of the life of an innocent person. When we look at the natural law, getting there, positive law. When we look at the natural law, remember that what is the first inclination of human nature? What is the first inclination of human nature? Let's see. Ms. Reyes, what is the first inclination of human nature according to the natural law? Do you remember? No. Okay, well, there we go. Moving on. Let's see. Mr. Thomas, do you remember the first inclination of human nature according to the natural law, enumerated by St. Thomas Aquinas? Ooh, that's a good answer, sir. But no. That is a good answer. To treat others as you want to be treated, that is certainly true, and it's a good ethical principle, but it's not what we're necessarily inclined to do, although it does tie into the first inclination in a way. Yes, Ms. Reeser. That is the first principle of practical action, yes, of the practical, whatchamacallit. I forget, the word's not coming to me, but that's good, yes. But no, not the first inclination. Yes, sir.
This could be way off, but is it put God first?
Put God first, always, sir. Yes. God bless you, sir.
Yeah.
But no. The first inclination, what are we inclined to? Remember, I talked about three inclinations. There are three things we're inclined to. The second one was we're inclined to procreation and the rearing of children, which we share with animals. There's the third one is the inclination for community, for knowledge of God. But the first one is the most basic. What's the most basic inclination that we have as creatures, and which we share with not just animals, but even plants and things like that? They reproduce. They have sex organs. Hello, Ms. Pullman. Again, like Freud, it always comes back to sex. Life, the preservation of life. What, did she say that? Well, Ms. Springart, good for you. Okay, so the first inclination, according to the natural law, of the tendency of our human nature is to preserve our life. That's why we go to hospitals. That's why we feed ourselves. All living things tend towards this, to promote and preserve life. A person should have a natural love for one's life and existence. We should want to be alive. And when someone doesn't want to be alive, we know there's a problem. Hence, you have suicide hotlines, or, if you go to see a counselor, they might ask you, I think it's kind of becoming standard now to ask you, do you have any thoughts of harming yourself or anybody else, And if you say yes, and you're serious, they can't let you leave. They can't just let you go. They have to address it, because they don't want you to self-harm or to harm somebody else. So this inclination towards life is recognized. You should have a natural love for your existence. As creaturely beings, physical material beings, it just so happens that our bodies can get damaged. They get sick. They get old. And that's what old age is. It's damage to the body. That's what happens. The cells in your body, through over reproduction, being reproduced over decades and decades, become less and less good copies of the original cells, and so they degenerate. And we call that old age. So our bodies can get damaged. Death and suffering are regrettable because they don't represent benefits or goods of human nature. In other words, no one wants to suffer and die. So death and suffering are not goods of human nature. Where death and suffering come from, well, we can talk about that theologically, and we can talk about the whole Adam and Eve story and stuff like that. But nevertheless, I think, even if you're not a religious person, you recognize that death and suffering are not a benefit to human nature. Although regrettable and not intended by God originally, death and suffering are natural experiences. They are now naturally part of our human experience. What God intended is another story. And natural experience and occurrences of human existence. So death should be welcomed or accepted naturally. When I say welcome, I don't mean that you like it. All of us here are going to have to welcome death at some point. Hopefully it's not, God forbid, it's not a violent death, or it's not a death with pain and suffering. But there are people who simply die, anyone who maybe has been around old people or lived in an old age community or worked at one or volunteered at one, God bless you. It's a fact of life. It's like every week or something, someone dies in her sleep or dies in his sleep. Men, I wasn't there, but I'm presuming that there wasn't a lot of suffering. The body just naturally stopped working at some point. So it's welcomed and accepted naturally. It doesn't mean you have to like it, like, oh, I want to die, Pain and suffering can also be accepted. And we do this. Why do people not want to go to the gym? Because it hurts. Or it's boring, which is a form of mental pain, But mostly, if you go to the gym, you're sore. You do your exercises, you do whatever, you lift your weights, you're tearing muscle in your body, which is why weightlifters drink all these protein shakes and stuff like that, because you need to rebuild the muscle. Your body needs protein for that. But why soreness is damage. You have caused pain to your body. It hurts to get out of bed the next morning. That's pain, that's suffering. And you accept it. Why? Because you see a benefit to that pain and suffering. Pain and suffering can be seen as a good. You'll build stronger muscles. You'll lose weight because muscle burns more calories than just anything else. So if you want cardiovascular activity, yes, like jogging or running or something like that, or moving around, but also it needs to be combined with building up more muscle, lean muscle, which burns calories. I only know this because I'm fat and I think about it a lot. And I think about, okay, how can I be not fat? So anyways. There are times where we accept, say, little amounts of suffering in our life. Or we might actually accept major amounts of suffering in our life. Sometimes. Some people have to go through cancer treatments. Well, they don't want to die, so they go through the chemotherapy or the radiation therapy, which is painful. You're nauseous, you're throwing up, you can't keep anything down, you're tired all the time, you're mentally you're wasted. You have to go through these treatments, these long treatments, and they take a long time, and all with the hope that through these treatments the cancer won't come back. There's no guarantee the cancer won't come back. So sometimes people would take on major amounts of pain and suffering for, again, seeing it as a benefit for certain reasons. So pain and suffering can be accepted. It's not always a non-negotiable that I cannot suffer and feel pain. But if pain and suffering is not accepted, then it ought to be treated and alleviated accordingly. You treat the pain or suffering. It's part of the person's condition that should be treated. Since it's not in our nature to want to die or suffer, death or suffering should not be brought about intentionally or artificially. This is including on oneself. This is what's going on with euthanasia. It's an artificial imposition of death, of the natural process of death, in order to relieve pain and suffering. So to naturally relieve pain and suffering, that's right. Natural means drugs. There are a variety of drugs. And unfortunately, the body can also habituate to the drugs. So sometimes the usefulness of a certain drug might wear off. So you try another pain relieving drug, and if that wears off, then the ultimate decision is really sedation. You can put the person into a deep sedation, not a coma, but you sedate the person so that they're asleep all the time, basically, so they can't feel the pain or they're not suffering through the pain as much. But there are treatments to alleviate. Euthanasia is causing an intentional and artificial solution to the death and suffering. From the perspective of the natural law, taking the life of an innocent human being is an intrinsically evil action. So the moral object is bad from the start, no matter what intention there might be. You might have the intention of mercy, compassion, which is good. Those are good things. But the action is intrinsically evil. And again, what does that mean? It means that there are certain actions that never perfect human nature. And bringing about death is never a perfection of human nature. It's something we have to suffer through. It's an evil of human life. And as pain and suffering are evils, they don't perfect human nature necessarily, depending on how you use them, because there are instances where you can survive through pain and suffering that can build up your character. As I said, like going to the gymnasium, or a person who goes through cancer treatments, you come out hopefully stronger at the end. But an intrinsically evil action is always bad, always at any time in any place, because it just from experience, performing certain actions never seems to produce the good that you want. It might produce some good in the short term, maybe even in the long term, but the disvalue of the action always seems to mitigate against it. But someone might say, the action is one of mercy, actually. It's not killing per se, it's one of mercy, which is to relieve pain. So the moral object is a good one. Someone might try to reverse it and say, well, wait a second, you're saying that the object is killing and the intention is, a mercy or compassion, but let's switch this around and say, no, what you're trying to do is relieve pain. And you could think about the principle of double effect, that your action, the moral object, is to relieve pain. Your intention, relieve pain in a compassionate way. And so the good effect is the relief of the pain, but the bad effect, you could say, is the death which is tolerated. You tolerate the death of the person. The problem with that is that the intention is still to do this, to relieve the pain through bringing about death. The goal and the end of the action is for the person to die. So the intention, which is I'm intending the death of the person in order to bring about the relief of pain, which I could say is my moral object. My action is to relieve pain, but your intention is to do it through killing the person. The intention still, remember, makes the possibly good object a bad one. So even if the object is good, which is to relieve the pain of the person who's in intense suffering, your intention to do it through your goal of killing the person, taking the person's life, is bad. And a bad intention can take away the goodness of a moral object. It can warp it and turn a good action into a bad one still. So we're still on the same ground here. Positive law. Here's where things get sticky, because positive law should be based on the natural law and should be based on truth. But since we're dealing with human beings who disagree, or who don't always see things the same way, or who don't always see things clearly or rationally, this is where it gets sticky and we have disagreement. But not sometimes, but not always. Ideally, positive law should be in agreement with truth and the natural law, but since we're fallible human beings, we're also sinful, our intellects are darkened by our own evil practices, this does not always happen. But we have some indications. I'll focus mainly on the United States, although this has been an issue in other countries. The main thing we want to look at for the idea, or the issue of euthanasia, is a Supreme Court decision, a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1997 called Vacco versus Quill. See the long title there, Vacco, Attorney General of New York, et al., which means and others, versus Quill et al. And others. This was a case that started in New York State, where New York had legally banned physicians from administering lethal medications or other helping end the life of patients, even if the patient was consenting, competent, and terminally ill. Now, it's interesting that a lot of these euthanasia cases, they start out by focusing on the terminally ill, but it always seems to become, I shouldn't say always, but in most cases, in most cases, it seems to be extended from terminally ill to people who are just not feeling good, you know? It becomes terminally ill, then it becomes people who are mentally ill, then it becomes people who maybe aren't worth surviving because they have a serious disability. It seems to get extended, at least in countries like the Netherlands, that's what's happened. But it starts out with the terminally ill. A group of doctors sued the state, and they argued that while terminally ill patient, in the case of a terminally ill patient who is lawfully refusing treatment, which would be passive voluntary euthanasia, the person is dying and refuses treatment to be able to die, that person's right to ask the physician to actively end his or her life was not made lawful, which in their case didn't make any sense. So they thought that the New York law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, which is in Amendment 14, I believe, since persons in similar situations were being treated unequally. So they weren't being equally protected. It was the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. But 14, whoops. Yeah. So since a person in one case who said no more treatment because I want to die his wishes were being respected, but someone who says I want you to treat me by causing me to die, her wishes were not being respected, that was unequal, and that's what they argued. However, the Supreme Court returned a ruling 9-0, so they lost, obviously, that New York, well, I shouldn't say they lost, spoiler alert, they lost, 9-0, so there's a landslide against them, that the New York ban on physician-assisted suicide was constitutional. In other words, there was no constitutional guarantee of a fundamental right to die. And the majority opinion was authored by the Chief Justice at the time, who was a man named William Rehnquist. Here's a picture of him, and this is just a quotation from it. And I give this quotation, it's a long one, only because notice the moral principles that he's invoking. It ties into some of the things that we've been talking about. So I want to show you that even in legal situations, some of these ethical principles come into play. He makes this distinction. He says, furthermore, a physician who withdraws or honors a patient's refusal to begin life-sustaining medical treatment purposefully intends or may so intend only to respect his patient's wishes and, quote, to cease doing useless and futile or degrading things to the patient when the patient no longer stands to benefit from them. Okay, so there's a benefit analysis. The patient is asking for these life-sustaining treatments to be removed because they're futile, or in other words, there's no benefit to them anymore. The body is dying, and it's just let me die. Okay, it's a natural process. Whether I like it or not is another question. And that's just a quotation from some testimony that a Dr. Leon Cass gave, so I just give you the source of the quotation so you know. The same is true when a doctor provides aggressive palliative care, okay, so care to treat suffering and pain in the person. In some cases, pain-killing drugs may hasten a patient's death, but the physician's purpose and intent is, or may be, only to ease the patient's pain, okay? And that that I've heard this is the case with opioids, like I think morphine's an opioid, but opioids in general, that because they depress the respiratory function, they cause you, at certain amounts, they can stop you from breathing. But anyways, they can hasten death by giving certain drugs to treat pain. I'm not sure how true that is. I read in another place that that's probably a myth, that these drugs actually affect the body that much in order that they hasten death. But it is still a possibility. But the main point is that in giving the intention, the act of giving a drug to treat pain, the moral object is not a bad one, because I'm doing a good thing, which is to relieve a person's pain and suffering, which is obviously good. My intention is not to kill them. My intention is to relieve their pain. My intention is to relieve the pain through giving this drug. So the moral object and the intention are, I would say, good ones. In the principle of double effect, the bad effect is that, yes, it may in some way incrementally cause the earlier death of the patient through doing this, but that's not intended. I'm intending to relieve the pain and suffering. Yes, Ms. Pullman.
I was just going to say something about morphine. I know they use morphine in like hospice cases where they're trying to prevent the patients have air hunger, where they're close to death and they're like gasping for air and they can't really get anything.
Yeah.
Morphine because they know it depresses their lung function, so it stops them from like gasping, but they get less air, obviously.
Oh, okay.
So I know they use it in hospice. It does like depress respiratory function.
Did you do that for a while, or just a volunteer? Or?
Well, I didn't do it actually. I just like research.
Oh, okay.
And stuff, yeah.
All right. Excellent. Thank you. Didn't know that. Air hunger. I'll have to remember that. Yes. So, I mean, from as I was saying, from the principle of double effect, you're doing a good action. You're giving your actions at least indifferent. You're giving a drug according to your competency as a physician, or the nurse if you're told to give the drug. Your intention is not to do harm, but to relieve pain and suffering, which you're doing. So that's a good effect. But the bad effect might be that it does hasten or in some way affect the body, that it might become weaker and die sooner. That's a bad effect, obviously. You don't want the person to die, although it's inevitable, probably. So the effect is tolerated, is accepted, even though it's not intended directly in the action. A doctor who assists a suicide, however, quote, must necessarily and indubitably or undoubtedly intend primarily that the patient be made dead. So the primary, even if you say, well, I'm doing a good thing, I'm relieving pain, that's a good thing. The intention is still bad, which transforms the moral object into a bad one if we look at it from that perspective. Because you are intending to do it not through using drugs, but using, say, drugs to cause the death. Similarly, a patient who commits suicide with a doctor's aid necessarily has the specific intent to end his or her life, which I think is kind of obvious, hence it's called suicide. And even those who approve of it would say, yes, it's physician-assisted suicide, while a patient who refuses or discontinues treatment might not. So a person who discontinues treatment, they might still go on living. And that's probably the purpose. They want to go on living as long as they can. That's the operative word there. They can, until the body cannot live anymore, not brought to a non-living state. Another court case that I'll just touch upon, but it's related and came out in the same year as Washington versus Glucksberg, which was this was Vacco versus Quill. Was in New York State, but this had to do with a similar law in Washington State, the state of Washington, which had banned euthanasia. And again, the argument was made, well, I shouldn't say again, the argument was made that this violated the 14th Amendment, but a different part of the 14th Amendment, which grants due process. Due process means that rights must be respected under law. The government can't just take away someone's liberty, someone's freedom, without due process of law. And they were arguing, the people who were arguing against the ban in Washington were arguing that this violated their due process. They had a right to die, and it was being taken away by law. But the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the arguments from due process, saying again that assisted suicide is not a fundamental right. Basically, their argument in general was that euthanasia was not a right that could be historically established. You couldn't go through the laws of the states of America, of the whole, the states that we have now, and go through the history and find, okay, yes, we can see here the state of Delaware, recognized the right of euthanasia. The state of Oregon recognized it. Texas recognized it. And it's only like recently that these bans have come into play. Like, no, in fact, it was the reverse. Bans against euthanasia seemed to be the norm. However, there would be developments. Oregon, I mentioned. Oregon in 1994 would have a referendum, actually. It's called the Death with Dignity Act, or was called the Death with Dignity Act, aka Oregon Ballot Measure number 16, because it was put on the ballot for voters of Oregon to decide whether there should be permitted euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide in the state. And you can see the results there. 51% in favor, 49% were not in favor. I probably should have made that clear on the PowerPoint. I apologize. 51% were in favor and 49% were not in favor, which was enough. It kind of squeaked by, but it was enough to approve the ballot measure so that the U.S. state of Oregon became the first state to permit the practice of physician-assisted suicide for terminally ill patients in 1994. Notice it's before Vacco and Quill, which was in 1997, and Washington and Glucksberg. So, presumably a state could establish the right to euthanasia, but not as a constitutional right, according to the federal Constitution. When Vacco and Quill and Washington and Glucksberg came out in 1997, there was an effort to try to repeal the Death with Dignity Act, but it was rejected by 60%. So you can see the difference in timing made within, a relatively short period of time. Only 51% approved the measure in 94, but within 3 years you had 60% saying, no, we want to keep this. Several countries now allow euthanasia. The Netherlands, and I have a map here. Well, actually, no, I don't have a map. I do have a map. Sorry. Map of the world. I'll go to this map first. The Netherlands was the first to approve euthanasia. Actually, I shouldn't say that. That's technically not true. Euthanasia is still technically a crime in the Netherlands. If you want to know where the Netherlands is, it's a small country here at the north of Europe, okay, in green here on this map. Small sea-bound country bordered by the sea and the ocean. And the Netherlands was the first. I shouldn't say that it was the first to legalize euthanasia, because it's not technically true. Euthanasia is still a crime on the books for us, for people like us, but not for doctors, not for physicians. If a physician performs euthanasia under a set of conditions, which have been laid out by the Dutch courts, then it doesn't say that what they did is right, and it's not a crime. According to Netherlands law, it says they won't be prosecuted, Ms. McLean. So there's a difference there, yes? If they follow the conditions, they will not be prosecuted under the euthanasia law, which still is on the books and makes it illegal for us to do it. I would be prosecuted if I did it. But a physician who goes through even if I go through the conditions, but I'm not a physician, but a licensed physician who does it according to the conditions in the Netherlands can so do it. So this first comes to pass in the Netherlands. So it's considered, sometimes we hear that the Netherlands is the first to approve of or legalize euthanasia, which is not, you can tell the person, well, it's not technically true, it's still illegal, but it can be practiced. And since then, the conditions have expanded to the point where you have Dutch doctors under the Groningen Protocol arguing that you can euthanize severely disabled infants after birth. Called the Groningen, which is very controversial, but apparently not controversial anymore in the Netherlands because they've been doing it. So if a woman gives birth to a baby that has severe disability, they can actively, involuntarily euthanize it and kill it. So several countries now allow it. We can see here on the map which countries allow it. They're in the green. We'll start over here. You have New Zealand. You have parts of Australia. Not all of Australia. This is the Northwest Territory. Apparently it's illegal there. So Australia, Spain, in Europe, the Netherlands I mentioned, Under certain conditions, it's a doctor can prescribe medication but not administer it. You have to do it yourself. In Switzerland and Austria, apparently Germany and Italy, it's under debate there. Colombia in South America. The United States, only in certain states, which I'll show you in a moment. Canada, the country of Canada. Are there any others I'm missing? No, I don't think so. And this is as of 2022, so there may have been some changes since then in the last year, but should be relatively accurate, an accurate map. And the United States, since Oregon was the first to do it, and I know they say Oregon and Oregon, but I'm from New Jersey, and that's how I've said it my whole life. And I'll be in my grave still saying, you'll hear me, you're bending low, and you'll hear me, Oregon, Oregon. And don't worry about me, Ms. Dela Cruz, because I'll be in the great Indian buffet in the sky. Yes. Come on, you have to keep up, people. It was November. All right. Oregon was the first state, and then I don't know what in order which the states did it. Oh, don't do that to me, because I wasn't even near you. But you have other states. So you see Washington State, California, Montana. That's through a court decision. Colorado, New Mexico, Hawaii, euthanasia is legal. The District of Columbia, which is not a state, technically it's a district. New Jersey, Vermont, and Maine. So those are the states. And all the rest of these states, euthanasia is illegal. In the red states, or the pink states, euthanasia is not legal. Support for euthanasia has increased. Apparently the Gallup poll people have been monitoring this since way back in the late 1940s. So who knew? But back in the 1940s, 1947, approval for euthanasia of some sort was at 37%, and there's been an increase pretty much ever since through the 50s, the 60s. Highest rate here starts in the 90s, the mid-90s, which is right around where we have, well, we'll see Dr. Kevorkian, we have, the approval in Oregon, so, and it's kind of leveled out since then, and now it stands around 72% of Americans say that you should have it as a right, it should be allowed by law. So that's where we stand with the electorate. So that's positive law. So we have on the federal level a clear indication that the right to die is not a fundamental right of the Constitution under the 14th Amendment. But in the states, we do have in certain states that it is a fundamental right to die, but it's now given by law, and in some states they might say it's part of their constitutions at the state level. So now we have a contradiction. We have positive law, which is now disagreeing, and as you saw, most of the United States does not have laws approving of euthanasia. They have laws on the opposite, banning it. So you have banned here and legal in another place. So the positive law, this is where I said it kind of gets dicey and kind of gets sticky, because we can appeal to positive law, but the positive laws themselves disagree amongst human beings. Well, what's that? Okay, so usually at our time. Yeah, my buzzer's going off. So I'll stop here, and I will finish up on Thursday. So have a good day.
Do we have another quiz?
Yeah, we have one last quiz, quiz number 5, which should be the end of next week.
Okay. And then for the final, it's 600 points?
600? Is that what I say?
Is it like the same as the quiz?
It's the same as the quiz. It's going to be, multiple choice. Spoiler alert again, and giving away my secrets. I'm basically using the questions from the quiz, so I will select definitely, because I can't do all the questions because it's only 2.5 hours long, I think. So yeah, I'll be selecting main questions from the various quizzes, and I might change them a little bit. No, I won't. And we put on there, so it is cumulative.
All right. Do we take it in here or at home?
No, you take it at home. Yeah, I won't be here. That's why I'm doing it online. And you'll have all of exam week to do it.
Awesome.
You're welcome. Have a good day. What are you doing to me? Let's go in. What's going on? Look at this. It's going crazy.
Have a good day.
Have a good day. You too. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Have a good day. Well, the thing is that it's not gonna. Well, I can still take notes for it for the future, but move on. That's going nuts out. Oh, sorry to turn you off, my friend.